When Shaquille O'Neal climbed into the back of a black SUV on a cold January morning in 2024, he thought it was going to be a normal day. He had a speaking engagement. He had meetings. He had the kind of packed schedule that comes with being one of the most famous human beings on the planet. 4 NBA championship rings, a Hall of Fame career, a billion-dollar business empire, and a face so recognizable that strangers stopped him in airport terminals in countries where they didn't even speak English. Normal day, normal Shaq, normal life. Then his phone buzzed. One text message. From his mother, Lucille. 8 words. "Baby, I found out something. It's about Miss Estelle." And just like that, nothing was normal anymore. Because Miss Estelle wasn't just anyone. Miss Estelle was the woman who had changed everything. She was the small, fierce, 5'0" teacher who had looked at a giant, awkward, terrified 12-year-old Shaquille O'Neal, the new kid, again, in another new city, too tall for every chair and too embarrassed to speak, standing in the wrong classroom doorway in Newark, New Jersey, in the fall of 1984, and said the 4 words that would quietly power every single thing he would ever accomplish for the rest of his life. "Come in. You belong." 4 words. That's all it took. And Shaq had carried those 4 words through every new city and every hard room, and every moment of doubt, all the way to the top of the world. But here's what he didn't know. Here's the part that broke him open on a cold January morning in the back of that SUV. While he had been winning championships and signing $100 million contracts and becoming one of the most powerful figures in the history of American sports, the woman who had given him his beginning was sitting alone in a small house in Newark, New Jersey, with a broken roof held together by a blue plastic tarp and bricks, a heating bill she couldn't pay, and arthritis so bad some mornings she could barely get out of her chair. Stelle Marguerite Boykins had spent 43 years giving everything she had to other people's children, and the world had given her almost nothing back. What Shaq did the moment he found out, the decision he made in the back of that car, the calls he made standing on her icy front porch without a proper coat in the January cold, the thing he found inside a shoebox under her bed that made this 7-foot giant break down and cry, is one of the most extraordinary true stories you will ever hear. And there is a secret at the center of it, a letter, written in 1985 by a 42-year-old teacher about a 12-year-old boy she had known for only a few months, sealed shut, never opened, kept for 39 years, waiting. What was inside that letter, what she had written about him before he was anyone, before the world knew his name, before a single basketball had been dunked or a single trophy had been lifted, will stop you completely. Because she knew. Somehow, impossibly, she knew exactly who he was going to become. And the last line of that letter, the line that made Shaquille O'Neal go quiet, in a way that nobody who knows him had ever seen before, is something that once you hear it, you will never forget. Stay with us for the whole story, because this one is worth every single minute. On a cold Tuesday morning in January 2024, Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal sat alone in the back of a black SUV, rolling through downtown Newark, New Jersey. His enormous hands, hands that had palmed basketballs like oranges, hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, hands that had held 4 NBA championship trophies, were folded quietly in his lap, like he didn't know what to do with them. His phone screen glowed with a single text message from his mother, Lucille O'Neal. "Baby, I found out something. Call me when you can. It's about Miss Estelle." 3 words. Miss Estelle. Shaq hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in almost 30 years. But the moment he read it, something cracked open deep inside his chest, the way old wood cracks when the weather finally gets too cold. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a slow, quiet split that goes all the way through. He didn't call his mother back right away. Instead, he pressed his forehead against the cold car window and stared out at the gray Newark streets rolling past. Bare trees, brick buildings, a woman pushing a stroller against the January wind. A church with its doors propped open even in the cold. Somewhere out there, beyond the glass and the noise and the fame and the 4 championship rings sitting in a safe back at his Orlando home, the woman who had told a giant, awkward, scared 12-year-old boy that he was worth something was out there, struggling, hurting, alone. What Shaq did next would stun the entire world. But to understand why he did it, you have to go back, way back, before the dunks that shattered backboards, before the rings, before the movies, and the music, and the billions of dollars. You have to go back to a classroom in Newark, New Jersey, in the fall of 1984, where a small, fierce, 42-year-old woman named Estelle Marguerite Boykins looked up at a tall, terrified boy standing in her doorway and said the 4 words that changed his life forever. "Come in. You belong." Newark, New Jersey, September 1984. The school was called Chancellor Avenue Elementary School, and it sat on the east side of Newark, New Jersey, like a tired old soldier that refused to fall down. Brick walls the color of dried mud, metal doors that clanged when they shut. Linoleum floors so worn thin you could see the gray concrete peeking through underneath, scuffed by 40 years of sneakers belonging to 40 years of children who had walked these halls and grown up and moved on. The hallways smelled like floor wax and cafeteria food and the particular kind of chalk dust that settles into everything when a building is old enough. Radiators knocked and hissed. Classroom doors had small square windows of wire-reinforced glass. The water fountains ran cold for 2 seconds, and then warm. The gym had a basketball hoop, whose net had been replaced so many times the newest one didn't quite match the color of the old metal ring. It was not a glamorous place, but it was a place. And in September of 1984, it was full of the particular noise of children beginning something. A new school year, a new grade, a new chance at being whoever they were going to be next. Kids ran the hallways with the wild energy of summer, still buzzing in their legs. They laughed too loud and bumped into each other and argued about nothing and everything. They were loud and alive, and entirely sure that whatever was happening to them right now was the most important thing happening anywhere. One kid didn't run. He moved through the hallway slowly, shoulders hunched forward, head slightly down, taking up space he didn't seem to want. His name was Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal, and he was 12 years old, and he was already almost 6 feet tall. He was enormous in the way that some children are enormous. Not just big, but overwhelmingly big, as if his body had received instructions meant for someone else, and was still trying to sort it out. His feet were size 17. His shoes were hard to find in that size, and when his mother, Lucille, did find them, they were expensive and clunky, and made him feel even more like something that didn't fit. He knocked things over without meaning to. He bumped door frames when he turned sideways. Smaller kids, and all the kids were smaller kids, looked up at him the way people look at buildings. Not with cruelty necessarily, just with the honest shock of something unexpected. Some of them laughed. Shaq had learned not to react to the laughing. He had been the new kid in enough schools by now to know that reacting only made it longer and louder. His stepfather, Philip Harrison, who Shaq called the sergeant when he was talking to other kids, and Dad when he wasn't, was a United States Army non-commissioned officer, and Army life meant moving, always moving, base to base, city to city, state to state. The family had been somewhere else before Newark. They would be somewhere else after Newark. The somewhere elses blurred together after a while. Different hallways, different teachers, different cafeterias with different smells, the same feeling of being new and temporary and outside the circle of kids who had known each other since kindergarten and had no particular reason to make room. Shaq was used to being the new kid. He was not used to it being easy. On his very first day at Chancellor Avenue, a Thursday in early September, because the family had arrived midweek after the drive from the previous posting, he was given a class schedule by the front office and sent to find his homeroom. The hallways had mostly emptied by then, everyone already seated in their classrooms, and the school felt like a maze of identical beige doors. He found what he thought was the right room. The number above the door matched the number on his schedule, or close enough. He'd misread a 6 as an 8 in his nervousness. He stood in the doorway. 30 heads turned toward him simultaneously. He was so tall that the top of the doorframe was roughly at eye level for him, which meant he had to bend slightly just to see properly into the room. He stood there, bent and enormous, holding a schedule that suddenly felt pointless, wearing sneakers that felt like boats, feeling all 30 pairs of eyes moving up and down the full vertical length of him. The room went quiet, not the respectful kind of quiet, the uncomfortable kind. The kind that happens when something unexpected walks in and everyone is trying to figure out how to respond. His face went hot. Under his dark skin, you couldn't see the flush, but he felt it. That particular burning embarrassment that goes from your chest to your ears. He wanted to step backward out of the doorway and pretend it had never happened. He was already calculating whether he could turn around without knocking into the doorframe again. Then a voice cut through the room. Not loud, not sharp, not the teacher voice that sounds like authority trying too hard. This was something different. This was a voice that had exactly the right amount of weight in it, like a hand placed gently but firmly on a shoulder. "Come in. You belong." He looked up from his shoes. At the front of the room, standing next to a chalkboard covered in neat cursive writing, was a woman who was perhaps the most unenormous person he had seen all day. She was maybe 5 feet tall on a good morning. She had short natural hair going silver at the temples, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a second pair of eyes she could lower when needed. She was wearing a yellow cardigan with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She was holding a piece of chalk, and she had turned from the board to look at him with the kind of directness that doesn't flinch. Her eyes were dark and clear, and entirely, completely calm. Her name was Estelle Marguerite Boykins. She was 42 years old. She had been teaching 5th grade at Chancellor Avenue Elementary School since 1970. 14 years of children, hundreds of them, coming through that same door in various states of confidence and confusion and need. She had seen the shy ones, and the angry ones, and the forgotten ones, and the ones who seemed fine on the surface and weren't. She had seen the bullied and the bullies, and the ones who weren't quite sure yet which one they were. She had a gift, not supernatural, not complicated, just rare. She could look at a child, really look, the way most adults had stopped bothering to do, and see what was actually going on inside them. She looked at the towering, burning-faced, hunched-shouldered boy in her doorway. She did not see a disruption. She did not see a problem. She did not see a physical joke waiting to be made. She saw a person who desperately needed to be told he was in the right place. "There's a seat right there by the window," she said, pointing. Her voice was calm and certain, like she had always known he was coming, and had saved that seat on purpose. "That's yours now." He moved to the seat. The chair groaned under his weight. It was a regular school chair, not built for a 12-year-old who weighed close to what a grown man weighed, and it protested accordingly. A couple of kids near him giggled. Not mean giggling necessarily, just the reflexive giggling of children when something unexpected makes a sound. Miss Boykins turned from the board, slowly, and looked at the giggling children with a look that wasn't angry and wasn't punishing. It was simply serious. The way a doctor is serious. The way a judge is serious. The kind of serious that doesn't need to announce itself. The giggling stopped, immediately. That was the first lesson Shaquille O'Neal learned from Estelle Marguerite Boykins, on the very first day, before she taught him a single thing from the curriculum. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to be the biggest thing in the room to command it. He sat in that chair for the rest of the morning and tried to listen and tried not to knock anything over, and mostly succeeded. And at the end of class, when the bell rang and the other students poured out, Miss Boykins didn't stop him. She let him go, But she watched him leave, and she was already, in the particular quiet of an empty classroom, thinking about the boy who carried himself like an apology. The weeks that followed that first September morning were not magical. They were not a movie montage of Shaq suddenly finding his people, suddenly laughing in hallways, suddenly belonging in the easy, visible way that kids on television always seem to belong. Real life doesn't work like that. Real belonging is slower and quieter and harder to see when it's happening. But something was different about Miss Boykin's classroom. She had a system, not a complicated one, but a deliberate one. Every morning, before the lesson began, she went around the room and asked each student one question, not about homework, not about yesterday's assignment. A real question. What did you notice this morning on your way to school? What is something you changed your mind about recently? If you could fix one thing about your neighborhood, what would it be? Most teachers, in Shaq's experience, asked questions that had right answers. Miss Boykins asked questions that had your answer. The first time she called on Shaq, a Tuesday, the second week of October, the question was, what is something that looks one way from the outside, but is completely different on the inside? The room turned to look at him. He felt the familiar heat start in his chest. He thought about saying a basketball, the leather outside, the hollow air inside. It was safe. It was correct. It wouldn't embarrass him. Instead, without entirely meaning to, he said, me, I guess. The room was quiet for a beat. Miss Boykins looked at him the way she always looked, directly, calmly, without rushing to fill the silence. That's the most honest answer anyone has given me in 14 years of asking that question, she said. She moved on to the next student. She didn't make a production of it. She didn't let anyone react or turn it into something. But Shaq sat straighter in his groaning chair for the rest of that morning than he had ever sat in any chair in any school. She kept him after class one Thursday in November. Not for trouble. She closed the door after the last student filed out, set down her chalk, and looked at him with her reading glasses still up on her forehead. Shaquille, she said, I can see that you're smart. You hide it because you're afraid of getting it wrong. But getting it wrong is how you get it right. Do you understand me? He didn't, fully. He was 12. But the way she said it, direct, without pity, without the soft apologetic cushioning that adults usually put around hard things when they say them to children, did something to him. It treated him like someone who could handle the truth. That alone felt like a gift nobody had wrapped for him before. Sergeant Harrison moved the family before the school year ended. It happened fast. The way Army moves always happened fast. A week's notice, boxes, a rental truck, a new city, a new base, a new start that felt, as always, less like a start and more like an interruption. Shaq didn't get to say goodbye to Miss Boykins properly. He left the way he always left, quickly, quietly, carrying only what fit in the boxes his mother packed. He carried her words further than he carried anything else. You belong. You're smart. Getting it wrong is how you get it right. He would go on to carry those words through every hard room and every new city and every moment of doubt, all the way to the very top of the world. And the top of the world, when he got there, was louder than anything he had ever imagined. By the summer of 1992, Shaquille O'Neal was 20 years old and the most talked-about basketball prospect on the planet. He had spent 3 extraordinary years at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, averaging 21.6 points and 13.5 rebounds per game over his college career. The Associated Press named him College Player of the Year in 1991. NBA scouts ran out of words trying to describe him and settled, eventually, on one phrase they kept repeating like a prayer: generational talent. On June 24, 1992, at the Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Portland, Oregon, the Orlando Magic selected Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal with the first overall pick in the NBA draft. The crowd didn't just cheer, it erupted. The sound rolled through the arena like something physical, like weather. Shaq stood up from his chair, all 7 feet and 1 inch, all 325 pounds of him. And he smiled, the big smile, the one that took up his whole face, and then kept going. The cameras fired like lightning. Hands reached for his. He put on the Magic's blue and black cap and held it above his head. He thought about Lucille, who had prayed for him every single night, without exception. He thought about Philip Harrison, the sergeant who had demanded discipline and given him the structure that made the discipline possible. He thought, briefly and quietly, about a woman in a yellow cardigan standing at a chalkboard in Newark, New Jersey, telling a scared boy to come in. You belong. Well, he belonged now. The whole world was saying so. The years that followed were a blur of greatness so complete it almost didn't seem real from the inside. In the 1992-93 season alone, his rookie year, Shaq shattered 2 backboards with his dunks. Not cracked, shattered. The NBA had to reinforce its hoop structures with breakaway rims because no existing equipment had been built to withstand what he could do to it. He won Rookie of the Year. He became an all-star. He became a phenomenon so large that the city of Orlando, a city that had never had a real basketball identity, a city built around theme parks and sunshine and tourists, fell completely, helplessly in love with him. In 1996, he signed with the Los Angeles Lakers for $120 million, the largest contract in the history of professional sports at that moment in time. He moved to Hollywood, and Hollywood rearranged itself to make room. Movies, platinum rap albums, magazine covers, his face on billboards in 6 countries. Then came Phil Jackson. Then came Kobe Bryant. Then came 3 NBA championships in a row. 2000, 2001, 2002. Shaq named Finals MVP, all 3 times. A feat of sustained dominance that had almost no comparison in the history of the game. Then a 4th ring in 2006, with the Miami Heat, alongside Dwayne Wade. 4 rings, 1 regular season MVP, 15 All-Star selections, more than 28,000 career points. He became more than a basketball player. He became a monument. But here is the true thing about monuments. The thing nobody says out loud, but everyone eventually understands. Monuments stand still. The people who built them keep moving. And some of the people who mattered most in the building, the ones who handed over the first brick before anyone knew what was being constructed, they can get left behind in the moving. Not out of cruelty, not out of forgetfulness exactly, but simply because life moves forward, and forward is the only direction that famous lives seem to know. Miss Estelle Marguerite Boykins had given Shaq his first brick, and the world had not given her nearly enough in return. Not yet. January 9, 2024, started as an ordinary Wednesday for Lucille O'Neal. She was 71 years old and still moved through the world with the quiet, unhurried dignity of a woman who had survived enough to know what was worth worrying about and what wasn't. She had raised Shaquille largely on her own in the early years, before Philip Harrison came into their lives and brought his army discipline and his steady hands. She had prayed her son through every city, every school, every hard night when he called her from some faraway dormitory or hotel room, sounding lost underneath the confidence. She was the kind of mother who knew things, not because she pried, because she paid attention. That Wednesday she had come back to Newark for a funeral. A cousin, her mother's sister's youngest boy, a quiet man named Earl Simmons Jr., who had worked 30 years at the Port Newark container terminal and died of a heart attack at 63. The service was held at Greater Abyssinian Baptist Church on Lyons Avenue, a tall red brick building that had stood in Newark's South Ward since 1935 and had held its arms open for every kind of sorrow the neighborhood had ever known. After the service, the repast was held in the church hall downstairs. Long tables covered in foil trays, macaroni and cheese and collard greens and fried chicken and pound cake. The particular warmth of a room full of people who are sad together and feeding each other through it. Lucille was standing at the food table, filling a small plate, when a hand touched her arm. She turned. The woman standing there was 78 years old, wide through the shoulders, with silver locks pinned up and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck. She was wearing a purple dress and an expression of someone who recognized a face and was very pleased about it. Her name was Dorothy Jean Hicks, former PTA president at Chancellor Avenue Elementary School, member of Greater Abyssinian for 46 years, owner of a memory so precise it bordered on unsettling. "You're Lucille," Dorothy Jean said, taking Lucille's free hand in both of hers. "Lucille O'Neill. I never forget a face. Your boy, the big one, he went to Chancellor Avenue. 5th grade. Must have been 84 or 85. Lucille smiled politely. "That sounds about right." Dorothy Jean's expression shifted. Something in it softened, and then went a little sad, the way faces go when they're about to deliver news that isn't entirely good. "You know Miss Boykins?" she said. "Estelle Boykins? She would have been his teacher." "I remember the name," Lucille said carefully. Dorothy Jean leaned in slightly, the way people do when what they're saying is meant for one pair of ears. "Lord, that woman. She retired from teaching back in 2003. 43 years in that building, honey. 43 years. Never made more than $50,000 a year at her peak." She shook her head. "She's still in that little house over on Kinney Street. Has been since 1981. Her husband passed in 2015. Reginald drove a NJ Transit bus. Lovely, lovely man. Patient. She doesn't have children of her own. She always said the children in her classroom were her children." Lucille set her plate down on the table. "Is she doing all right?" Dorothy Jean's eyes went to the floor, just for a second. But that second said everything. "She is not all right, honey." Her voice dropped lower. "The roof on that house started going bad in the summer of 2022, after those heavy storms we had. You remember how bad the storms were. She's on a fixed income now, just her Social Security, and a small pension from Newark Public Schools. Together, maybe a little over $2,000 a month. In New Jersey, the roof repair estimate came back at $14,000. Insurance fought her for months, and then paid her $2,100. She put a tarp over the worst part, and called it managed." Lucille was quiet. "The heating bill has gotten behind," Dorothy Jean continued. "Arthritis has gotten bad in her hands and her knees these last 2 winters. She won't ask for help. That's just who she is. Too proud. Too private. She'd rather sit cold than feel like a charity case." Dorothy Jean squeezed Lucille's hand once, and then let it go. "I just thought, if anyone ought to know, it ought to be someone who might actually be able to do something about it." She said it without pressure. Just plainly, the way you say a true thing and then leave it with the other person to carry. Lucille excused herself a few minutes later. She walked down the church hall to the bathroom at the far end, went inside, locked the door, and sat down on the closed lid of the toilet in her good funeral clothes. She sat there for a little while. She was not the kind of woman who fell apart in bathrooms. She had not fallen apart in bathrooms even in the genuinely terrible moments of her life. But she needed a minute. She needed to feel the weight of what Dorothy Jean had just put in her hands before she decided what to do with it. She thought about Shaquille at 12, the way he'd looked before he found basketball, before the game gave him a language for what his body could do and a reason to take up the space he took up. She thought about the nights he'd called her from new schools, new cities, his voice carefully flat in that way that told her he was struggling. She thought about how she had prayed and prayed and prayed, and she thought about the fact that somewhere along the way, a woman she had never properly met had looked at her son and said, "You belong here." She took out her phone. She typed 8 words. "Baby, I found out something. Call me when you can. It's about Miss Estelle." She pressed send. Then she washed her hands, straightened her dress, unlocked the bathroom door, and went back out to the repast to eat her macaroni and cheese and sit with her grieving family. Because life always asks you to hold more than one thing at a time. Shaq called her 23 minutes later. He was still in the back of the SUV, still moving through Newark traffic, the city gray and cold outside the tinted windows. He had stared at the text for the entire 23 minutes without responding, which was unusual for him. He was a man who responded fast, to texts, to business deals, to situations requiring decisions. Speed had always been one of his weapons, but he had sat with this one, quietly. The way you sit with something when you already know it's going to change the direction of your day, and possibly something larger than your day. His mother answered on the first ring. "Hey, baby." "Mom." His voice was low. What happened? It was not a question. It was the voice of someone who already understood the shape of the answer and just needed the details filled in. Lucille told him everything Dorothy Jean Hicks had said. Slowly, clearly, without editorializing. The roof, the tarp, the $2,000 a month, the heating bill, the arthritis, the pride that wouldn't let her ask for help. When she finished, there was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough that Lucille checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. It hadn't. "Mom!" Shaq said finally. His voice was so quiet and so controlled that she pressed the phone harder against her ear. "Yes, baby." "What's the address?" Lucille reached into her purse for the small notebook she always carried. She was of the generation that wrote things down on paper, a habit Shaq had always teased her about and privately admired. She found the page where she had written 214 Kinney Street, while Dorothy Jean was still talking. She read it to him. She heard him type it, or write it. She wasn't sure which. "Shaq, I'm going to go see her, Mom." "I know you are, baby." Another silence. Shorter this time. "She told me I belonged," he said. "When I was 12 years old and I didn't know a single thing about myself yet, she told me I belonged somewhere." His voice shifted on the last word. Not broke, shifted. The way a foundation shifts when something heavy moves across it. I never went back and told her what that meant. Lucille O'Neill, who had spent 51 years learning exactly how to love her son in the ways that actually helped him, said only this: "Then go back now, baby. It is not too late." He hung up. He sat in the silence of the SUV for exactly 1 more minute. His security guard and driver, a quiet 6'3" former Marine named Marcus Webb, glanced once in the rearview mirror and then looked away again. In 6 years of working for Shaq, Marcus had developed a precise and respectful understanding of which silences to leave alone. This was not a silence you touched. Finally, Shaq leaned forward. "Marcus," he said, "I need to change the route." "No problem, boss. Where are we going?" "Newark, Kinney Street, 214. Marcus typed it into the navigation without asking a single follow-up question. The SUV turned north through the gray January streets, and Shaquille O'Neal, 4-time NBA champion, global icon, the most dominant center in the history of professional basketball, sat back in his seat and looked out the window at the city where he had once been a scared 12-year-old boy who walked into the wrong classroom. He was going back to the right one. Kinney Street in Newark's South Ward is not the kind of street that appears in travel magazines or real estate features, or any list of places a person ought to see before they die. It is simply a street, the kind that exists in every American city that has ever known both better days and harder ones. The houses are small and set close together, shoulder to shoulder like people waiting in a line, each one with a short front yard, and a concrete stoop, and a story that the outside walls only partially tell. In summer, the stoops hold lawn chairs and potted geraniums, and grandmothers watching the neighborhood move. In January, they hold only cold air and whatever the last snowfall left behind when it stopped caring. The SUV rolled down Kinney Street slowly. Marcus Webb eased off the accelerator without being asked, understanding instinctively that this was not a moment for arriving fast. Numbers on doors and mailboxes ticked past the window. 210, 212, 214. The house was pale yellow, or it had been pale yellow once, in some more hopeful year when someone had stood back from a freshly painted front and felt good about the color they'd chosen. Now the paint was pulling away from the window frames in long curling strips, like the house was slowly trying to shed something. The front yard was mostly hardened ice with 2 inches of old snow on top, undisturbed except for a narrow path someone had salted from the stoop to the sidewalk. The storm door had a crack running diagonally across the lower pane, patched with 2 strips of clear tape applied with the careful precision of someone who took broken things seriously even when they couldn't fully fix them. And on the left side of the roof, visible even from the street, even from inside the warm SUV, a blue plastic tarp, weighted down at the corners with bricks, covered an area roughly 8 feet wide. The edges of it moved slightly in the January wind. A tired, practical, heartbreaking solution to a problem that should not have been left to a 79-year-old woman to solve alone. Shaq looked at the tarp for a long moment before he opened the car door. Then he got out. The cold hit him immediately, the particular sharp cold of a Newark January that doesn't negotiate. He was wearing a gray hoodie and sweatpants, clothes suited for the speaking engagement he'd been heading to before this, not for standing on winter sidewalks. He felt the cold across his shoulders and the back of his neck, but he didn't move quickly. He stood on the sidewalk in front of 214 Kinney Street, and he looked at it. He looked at the tarp. He looked at the peeling paint. He looked at the taped storm door and the icy yard, and the single light burning behind the frosted window to the left of the door. He breathed out slowly. The breath came out white in the cold air. Then he walked up. The path to the stoop was narrow, and his feet nearly touched both edges of it simultaneously. He climbed the 3 porch steps carefully, feeling the give in the concrete, registering without meaning to that the middle step bent slightly under his weight, not dangerously, but noticeably, the way things bend when they've been bearing weight longer than they were built to. He knocked. The sound of his knuckles on the metal storm door was louder than he intended. He always forgot, with hands his size, how loud a knock could be. Silence from inside. Then, movement. Slow, deliberate movement. The sound of it traveling clearly through the thin walls of the small house. A chair being pushed back. The particular rhythm of someone who has learned to move carefully, because moving carelessly costs something. A soft, regular tapping that he would understand, when she appeared, was the sound of a wooden cane on a linoleum floor. A light came on behind the frosted window. Footsteps approached the door. The inner door opened first. Then, behind the cracked storm door, she was there, 79 years old, smaller than he remembered, though he understood immediately that this was his own memory playing tricks, because he had been 12 when he last stood near her, and she had seemed taller to a 12-year-old than she did to a man of 7 feet. She was shorter now, only in the way that time makes people shorter, settling them gently but insistently toward the earth. She was wearing a thick quilted robe, the color of dark plums and house slippers, with rubber soles. Her white hair was close-cropped and neat. She had clearly not been expecting company, but she was the kind of person who maintained herself regardless of audience. Her left hand rested on a wooden cane, the grip worn smooth at the top in the shape of a palm. Her face, older now, mapped with the particular landscape of a long life lived in full, was composed and still in the way of someone who has learned to receive whatever comes to the door without falling apart at the sight of it. Behind her glasses, her eyes were exactly the same, dark, clear, present, the kind of eyes that don't look away. She looked at the enormous man filling her porch, the way a doorway fills when something too large tries to pass through it. She looked at him for exactly 3 full seconds. Long enough to be certain, not long enough to perform the certainty. Then she said his name. Not "oh my God," not a scream, not the theatrical disbelief of a television reunion show. Just his name, spoken in the same voice that had cut through a room full of staring children 40 years ago. quiet, level, carrying exactly the weight it needed to carry, and not 1 ounce more. Shaquille. His throat closed. In 40 years of public life, he had heard his name said 10,000 different ways, shouted from arenas, chanted by crowds, whispered by his children when they wanted something, announced by broadcasters in 7 languages, printed on jerseys, billboards, contracts, headlines. He had never heard it said the way she said it. Like it was simply his. Like it had always belonged to him, and she had simply been keeping it safe. "Miss Boykins," he managed. She pushed the storm door open. The cracked pane trembled in its frame. "You better come in before you freeze to death," she said, with the particular practicality of a woman who has spent a lifetime moving children from where they were to where they needed to be. "You are not dressed for January, Shaquille." Not even slightly. He ducked through the doorway, the automatic, unconscious duck of a man who had been ducking through standard doorways his entire adult life, and stepped into her living room. The room was small and clean in the way that takes effort to maintain. Not the effortless cleanliness of a large house with good appliances and someone to help. The deliberate, disciplined cleanliness of a person who has decided that her environment will remain dignified regardless of what else is happening. Every surface was clear. Every object was in its place. The bookshelves that lined 2 of the 4 walls were packed tight. Paperback novels, hardcover histories, education books with cracked spines from repeated use, photo albums with handwritten labels on the spines. The rug was old but clean. The curtains were drawn against the January cold. In the corner, a space heater hummed. The heat it put out was thin and orange, and working very hard for its size. The room was cool in the way that rooms are cool when the thing heating them isn't quite enough for the job. And on the walls, both the walls without bookshelves, covering them from a foot above the floor to nearly the ceiling, were photographs. School portraits, hundreds of them. Rows and rows of children in the particular formal yet casual style of school photos, across 5 decades. The wide collars of the 70s, the perms of the 80s, the awkward smiles of every era. Children of every age, from 5 to 14. Children who were now adults in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Each one framed simply, hung carefully. All of her students, all of her children. Shaq stood in the middle of the room and looked at that wall and felt something move through him that had no clean name. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't awe exactly. It was the feeling of suddenly understanding the true dimensions of something you had only seen a small piece of before. She had given 43 years of herself to children who came and went and grew up and moved on. She had kept every one of them here, on this wall, in this cold room, in this house that needed a new roof and a warmer heater. She had given everything, and the world had sent her a tarp and a heating bill. Miss Boykins moved past him to her armchair, positioned precisely, he noticed, to see both the wall of children and the front window at the same time, and sat down with the controlled care of someone managing a body that no longer moved on its own terms. She set her cane across her knees. She looked up at him standing in the middle of her living room. "Sit down, Shaquille," she said. "That sofa has held up for 30 years. It ought to manage you." He sat. The sofa creaked deeply, but held. They looked at each other across the small room. 40 years of distance and silence and separate lives sat between them like a third person in the space. She spoke first. "How did you find me?" And Shaq began at last to explain. He told her everything. His mother's text, the funeral on Lyons Avenue, Dorothy Jean Hicks and her precise, unsparing memory, the details she had delivered at the food table between one plate of macaroni and cheese and another, the roof, the tarp, the pension, the heating bill, the arthritis, the pride that wouldn't bend far enough to ask for help. Miss Boykins listened to all of it without interrupting once. This was something he had forgotten about her. Or not forgotten, exactly, but something he hadn't thought about in years because there had been no reason to think about it. She was the finest listener he had ever encountered. Not the kind of listening that is really just waiting for your turn to speak. Real listening. The kind where the other person becomes so still and so present that you find yourself saying things more honestly than you planned to, because the quality of the attention makes dishonesty feel pointless. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorothy Jean Hicks always did talk too much." There was no sharpness in it, just a dry, fond exasperation. The tone of someone speaking about a person they had known for 50 years and had made their peace with entirely. Shaq almost smiled. Almost. "Are you okay?" he asked. He looked around the room as he said it, at the thin orange glow of the space heater working too hard in the corner, at the heating bill sitting on the small table by the door. He could read the amount from where he sat. $847 past due. Miss Boykins followed his eyes to the bill. She looked at it without embarrassment and without apology. Just acknowledgement. "Here is a fact. Here it is. I manage," she said. "Miss Boykins. I have always managed," she said. Not defensive, not brittle. Simply certain. The way a person is certain about a thing they have proven to themselves over and over again across a very long time. I did not spend 43 years teaching children how to handle hard things so that I could fall to pieces over a heating bill at 79. Shaq nodded. He didn't argue. He had learned, at 12 years old, in this woman's classroom, that arguing with Estelle Boykins when she had decided something was an exercise in beautiful futility. You didn't argue. You listened. And then, if you were smart, you found a different door. He would find a different door. But not yet. "Tell me about yourself," she said then. Her voice changed. Not softer exactly, but warmer, opening in a direction it hadn't been open before. "And I don't mean the basketball. I don't mean the television program, or the business ventures, or whatever else Dorothy Jean has read about in magazines. I mean you. How are you doing, Shaquille? How are you actually doing?" Nobody asked him that. Or rather, people asked it constantly, in the performative way of people who expect a performative answer. Great. Blessed. Can't complain. He had given that answer so many thousands of times that it came out automatically now, before he even consciously decided to say it. He opened his mouth, and then he stopped, because she was looking at him with those eyes, the eyes that didn't look away, the eyes that had seen through the 12-year-old boy in the doorway and were apparently still perfectly capable of seeing through the 51-year-old man on the sofa. He closed his mouth, started again. He told her about his father, Philip Harrison, who had died in 2013. He told her that he still thought about him every single day, that grief was a strange thing that didn't get smaller so much as it got more familiar, like a piece of furniture in a dark room that you stopped walking into only because you learned where it was. He told her about his children, Sharif, Amira, Shakir, Meara, Tahira, Miles, and the particular terror of loving people that completely. He told her about the loneliness that lived, surprisingly and stubbornly, inside a life as large and loud as his. The way a packed arena could feel, in certain moments, like the loneliest place on earth. He talked for a long time. She listened for all of it. When he finally stopped, the room was quiet, except for the space heater and the distant sound of a car passing on Kinney Street. "You carry a great deal," she said simply. "Everybody does," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But not everybody carries it in front of 20,000 people at a time." He looked at her. She looked back. Then she said, "There is something I never told you, from when you were in my class." He went still. "The morning you came through my door," she said. "The wrong classroom. The first day. I want you to know that I already knew who you were. The principal had come to me that very morning. He said there was a new student, very tall, having a difficult adjustment. He asked me to keep an eye out." She paused, adjusted her glasses. "But when I saw you standing in that doorway, Not a prospect, not a problem, not a story anyone had told me about. Just a boy. I saw something that the principal hadn't mentioned, and probably hadn't noticed. Shaq was very still. The sofa didn't creak. The heater hummed. "You were ashamed," she said quietly. "Not embarrassed, not shy, ashamed. Of the space you took up, of the way people looked at you. You had been taught somewhere along the way, by accident, by the accumulated weight of too many stares and too many laughs, in too many hallways. That being what you were was something that required an apology." Her voice was entirely steady. She was not performing emotion. She was simply delivering a truth she had been holding for 40 years. "No child should feel that way," she said. "No person should feel that way. And so I said what I said, not as a kindness, not as a teaching strategy. I said it because it was true, and because you needed to hear it before anything else I was going to teach you that year could possibly matter." The room held the words. Shaq pressed his lips together. He looked at his hands, the enormous hands that had done so many things, folded in his lap. "I never thanked you," he said. "You didn't need to," she said. "I needed to," he said. She considered this. Then she gave a small nod, precise and dignified, like a period at the end of a sentence. "All right," she said. "Then thank me now." "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me when I didn't know how to be seen." The room was very quiet. Outside on Kinney Street, the January wind moved through the bare trees with a sound like breathing. Miss Boykins looked at her wall of children. All of them. All those faces looking back at her across the decades. Then she looked back at Shaq. "You are welcome," she said. "Now, are you going to sit here and thank me all afternoon, or are we going to talk about that roof?" And Shaquille O'Neal, for the first time since the SUV had turned onto Kinney Street, laughed. A real one. The big one. The laugh that took up the whole room. The sofa shook with it. It held. She said no. Of course she did. He hadn't even finished the sentence. Hadn't gotten past, "Miss Boykins, I want to," before she was already shaking her head with the calm, unhurried certainty of a woman who had made up her mind approximately 30 years before this conversation, and saw no compelling reason to unmake it. "I appreciate the thought, Shaquille," she said, "but I don't take charity." "It's not charity," he said. "Then what is it?" He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Here was the thing about Estelle Boykins that he was remembering in real time, sitting on her creaking sofa in the thin warmth of her too small space heater. She did not respond to volume. She did not respond to celebrity. She did not respond to the particular brand of confident momentum that had gotten Shaquille O'Neal through most of the negotiations of his adult life. The forward press of a large personality that made rooms rearrange themselves simply because it was easier than not rearranging. She had been immune to that in 1984. She was immune to it now. She simply sat in her chair with her cane across her knees, and her dark eyes steady behind her glasses, and waited for him to find a better argument than the one he'd led with. "Let me think about how to say it right," he said finally. She looked mildly, genuinely amused. "Take your time, Shaquille. I am not going anywhere." He sat forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He looked at the floor for a moment, at the old rug, clean and worn, that had probably been on this floor for 20 years, and he thought about what was actually true. Not what would sound good, not what would persuade, what was actually, honestly true. Then he looked up. "You spent 43 years giving," he said. "Every single day, in that classroom, you gave. To kids who came in scared, and left a little less scared. To kids who came in not knowing they were smart, and left with the beginning of an idea that maybe they were. To kids who never said thank you. Kids who forgot your name inside of a year. Kids who went off and did whatever they did, and never thought to come back." He paused. She didn't move. "You gave anyway," he continued. "Not because you expected something back. Not because you were keeping a ledger of what you were owed. You gave because that is simply what you do. That is who you are. The space heater hummed. A car moved slowly down Kinney Street outside. I'm not standing here with a checkbook because I feel sorry for you, he said. I don't feel sorry for you. You are the least pitiable person I have met in my entire life, and I have met a lot of people. He let that sit for half a second. I'm here because you gave me a foundation when I had nothing to build on. You handed me the first brick before I even knew what I was building. And I have been building on it ever since. The career, the business, all of it. And you have been sitting here in a house with a tarp on the roof, and I did not know, and that is something I have to fix. He leaned forward another inch. You told me once that getting it wrong is how you get it right. Well, Miss Boykins, I got this wrong. I should have found you sooner. I should have come back sooner. I can't fix the time. But I can fix the roof, and I would very much like your permission to do that. The room held the words. Miss Boykins looked at him for a long moment. The look of a woman running a very precise internal calculation, weighing dignity against practicality, pride against the honest acknowledgement of need, the principle of self-sufficiency against the reality of a blue tarp moving in the January wind directly above where she slept every night. You always were a talker, she said finally. The corner of his mouth moved. I learned from you. Something shifted in her expression. Not a collapse, not a surrender. Something quieter and more dignified than either of those. The particular softening of a person who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and has finally, in the presence of the right argument, delivered by the right person, decided it is safe to hold it a little less tightly. The roof is the main thing, she said. Her voice was quieter now, practical, moving into the territory of logistics rather than principle, which he recognized as progress. The cold gets in through the left side at night. I can feel it. I know, he said. I saw the tarp from the street. The front steps need attention too. The middle one has gone soft. I felt it when I came up. And the heating bill. I will take care of the heating bill before I leave today, he said. Before I get back in the car. She opened her mouth, closed it. He could see her working through the last of the resistance, not arguing with him, arguing with herself. With the version of herself that had managed alone for 9 years since Reginald died and had constructed a very careful, very dignified architecture of independence around that managing. He waited. He did not push. He had learned, at 12 and again right now, that the most important thing you could do in Estelle Boykins' presence was wait. She nodded. Once. Small and precise, like a signature on a document she had read very carefully. All right, she said. 2 words. Quiet as anything. But they opened everything. Shaq stepped out onto the new cold porch and made calls. He moved fast. This was the thing about him that the television version, the laughing, enormous, joke-cracking studio analyst, the pitchman, the performer, didn't always convey. Underneath all of that was a man of sharp, decisive, organizational intelligence. He had not built a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars by moving slowly when something needed to happen. He had built it by seeing what needed to be done and then doing it before the moment passed. His personal assistant, Vanessa Ortega, answered on the second ring from her desk in Orlando. She was 28 years old, 4 years into working for Shaq, and she had developed in those 4 years an almost preternatural ability to receive unusual instructions without expressing surprise. She had a notepad open before he finished his first sentence. He gave her the heating bill amount, $847, to PSE&G, New Jersey's primary electric and gas utility. She had it paid electronically within 40 minutes. He described the roof. She searched contractors in Newark while he was still talking, cross-referencing reviews, licensure, and availability. Within 20 minutes, she had found Precision Home Services, a well-regarded roofing company operating out of Frellinghuisen Avenue in Newark's Ironbound district. She had the owner on hold on another line before Shaq had finished telling her what he needed. The owner's name was Gerald Oma, a 53-year-old Nigerian-American contractor who had been running Precision Home Services for 19 years. He had a reputation, in Newark's contractor community, for doing work on time, doing it correctly the first time, and treating elderly homeowners with particular care and respect. Vanessa had read 3 different reviews that mentioned those exact qualities. She put Gerald through to Shaq. Shaq was on the phone with Gerald for 4 minutes. An inspection was scheduled for that Thursday. A full repair estimate would be provided within 48 hours. Gerald, who recognized the voice immediately but said nothing about it, and asked no questions beyond the professional ones, ended the call by saying simply, "We'll take good care of it." "I know you will," Shaq said. "Thank you, Gerald." The front steps. That was Marcus Webb. When Shaq came back inside and mentioned the soft middle step, Marcus, still sitting in the idling SUV at the curb, had already been looking at the porch. He had a background in carpentry that predated his security career by a decade. He had worked construction in Baltimore for 8 years, before a former client offered him something steadier. He got out of the car, climbed the steps himself, pressed the middle one with his boot, crouched down and looked at the underside of the frame. "Sister joist has separated," he said, standing back up. "Half a day's work if I have the right lumber. I can come back Saturday with materials." "I'll triple your pay for the weekend," Shaq said. Marcus looked at him. "Boss, I would do this for free." And the way he said it, quietly, without performance, made it clear that he meant it exactly as literally as it sounded. Inside the house, Miss Boykins sat in her armchair and held a fresh cup of tea in both hands, carefully, because the arthritis made her grip unreliable in the cold, and watched through her front window as the enormous man she had once seated by the window, 5th-grade classroom, paced her sidewalk in January without a proper coat, phone pressed to his ear, making things happen. She watched him for a long time. Something was changing in the room around her. Not in the furniture or the walls, or the thin warmth of the space heater. Something less visible than that. Something that had been sealed shut for a long time. Since Reginald, maybe, or since before Reginald, since the slow accumulation of years in which the world had quietly decided that her work was done and stopped paying attention, was opening. Carefully. Like a window being lifted by someone who understood that old windows need to be handled gently, or they stick. When Shaq came back inside, his face was purposeful and settled. The particular look of a man who has set things in motion and knows they will move. She held out a cup of tea. He took it without a word, sat back on the sofa, wrapped both enormous hands around the small mug. Steam rose between them, in the cool air of the room. "Thank you," he said. "You haven't done anything yet," she said. "Not for the house," he said. "For 1984. She looked at him across the steam. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Outside on Kinney Street, the January wind moved through the bare branches of the single oak tree at the edge of the yard. The one that had been there, she had always believed, longer than the house itself. It made a sound that was almost like something being said in a language just beyond understanding. Miss Boykins looked at her wall of children. All those faces. All those years. Then she looked back at the man on her sofa. "You all make me proud," she said quietly. "Every single one." Shaq did not post about it. This was the first thing that surprised people later, when the story eventually came out. And it did come out, because true stories of this size and weight cannot be contained forever, no matter how carefully the people inside them try to hold them close. But in those first days, Shaq said nothing publicly. No Instagram post, no tweet, no carefully composed statement released through his publicist, no teary reveal on Inside the NBA with Charles Barkley leaning forward in his chair. Nothing. He got back in the SUV on the afternoon of January 9th, and he told Marcus to drive, and he looked out the window at Newark moving past, and he kept what had happened in that small, pale yellow house, entirely, deliberately to himself. Not because he was ashamed of it, because it wasn't his to broadcast, it was hers. What he did instead was tell his mother. That evening, from his hotel room, he called Lucille and told her everything. The house, the wall of photographs, the tarp, the tea, the conversation that had gone to places he hadn't expected. Lucille listened the way she always listened, and at the end she said, "Baby, I am so glad you went." And he said, "Me too, Mom." And they stayed on the phone a little longer than the conversation required, the way people do when the conversation has been about something that matters. Lucille, being Lucille, mentioned it to Dorothy Jean Hicks when she called to thank her for the information. Dorothy Jean Hicks, being Dorothy Jean Hicks, mentioned it to 6 people at Greater Abyssinian Baptist Church the following Sunday morning, between the end of the service and the beginning of the fellowship hour. Those 6 people mentioned it to others. By the following Wednesday, January 17, 2024, a tip had reached the desk of a reporter named Brianna Caldwell at NJ Spotlight News, a respected New Jersey-based nonprofit news outlet that had been covering the state's communities, politics, and human stories, with careful, unglamorous dedication since 2010. Brianna was 26 years old, 2 years out of the Rutgers University School of Communication, assigned to the human interest desk with the energy of someone who still believed, genuinely and without irony, that stories about real people living real lives were worth telling as carefully as any political exposé. She was right about that. She tracked down a phone number for Vanessa Ortega's office line and left a message. Vanessa forwarded it to Shaq within the hour, with a single line of her own, "Your call." Shaq stared at the message for a while. Then he called Brianna back himself. She answered on the 3rd ring. There was a pause on her end. The brief, telling pause of someone who has received a call they expected to be a callback from an assistant, and has instead found themselves directly connected to one of the most famous human beings on the planet. She recovered quickly. He respected that. "Mr. O'Neill," she said, "thank you for calling me back. I want to talk to you about something before you write anything," he said. Not threatening, direct. The way he had always been direct with people he was taking seriously. "This story, I don't want it to be about me. I need you to understand that going in. This is about her, not about me." Brianna was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Mr. O'Neill, with respect, it's already becoming a story. I would rather it be told accurately by someone who spoke to the people involved than told incorrectly by someone who didn't." A pause on his end now, then a short laugh. Genuine, surprised out of him. "You remind me of my 5th-grade teacher," he said. Brianna Caldwell, to her considerable credit, did not scream. She wrote the story over 2 days. It was careful and restrained and human in the way that the best local journalism is human, specific, grounded, full of the kind of details that make a story feel true because they are true. The pale yellow paint peeling from the window frames, the wall of school portraits, the 43 years, the tarp held down with bricks. She included one quote from Shaq, which he had approved. It read, "She told me I belonged when I was 12 years old, and didn't have much else. 40 years later, the least I can do is make sure she has a warm house." The story ran on NJ Spotlight News on the morning of Thursday, January 18, 2024. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by the Newark Star-Ledger. By Saturday, it was on ESPN's front page. By Sunday, it was on CNN. By Monday, January 22nd, the story had been shared across social media platforms more than 11 million times. The hashtag Miss Boykins was trending simultaneously in the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Ireland, and, in a development that nobody at NJ Spotlight News could entirely explain, Australia. The comments were not the internet's usual noise. They were something else. People writing about their own teachers, their own Miss Boykinses, The ones who had seen them when they felt invisible. The ones who had said the right thing at the right moment, and probably never knew how far it had carried. Hundreds of thousands of people, then millions, surfacing private memories they had never thought to share publicly before. As if Breonna Caldwell's careful story had opened a door that a great many people had been standing behind, without realizing they were all standing there together. A GoFundMe page appeared on January 20th, created by a Newark resident named Tariq Delacour, 34 years old, a high school math teacher himself, a man who had never been in Miss Boykin's classroom, but felt, after reading the story, that in some important sense he had. He titled the page simply, "For the Teacher Who Gave Everything." It raised $40,000 in the first 12 hours. It raised $127,000 in 4 days. Former students began to surface, not just from 1984, from all 4 decades of her career. From the wide-collared 70s, the era of the Boykins classroom wall portraits Shaq had stood in front of and felt undone by. They wrote on social media, with the particular intensity of people who have been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to finally give them a reason to say the thing they had always meant to say. A woman named Carolyn Westbrook Diaz, 56 years old, a school principal in Trenton, New Jersey. A woman who had sat in Estelle Boykin's classroom in 1976, at the age of 8, and been told by that same steady voice that she was capable of more than she was currently attempting, drove to Kinney Street on a Saturday afternoon and knocked on the door. Miss Boykins opened it, looked at her, 48 years. "I always remembered your eyes," Miss Boykins said. Carolyn Westbrook Diaz, who had run a school of 400 students for 11 years, and had learned in those 11 years to handle almost anything with professional composure, burst into tears on the new front porch steps that Marcus Webb had rebuilt the previous weekend. Miss Boykins held the storm door open and said, with the same calm certainty she had always used when a child needed to stop standing in a doorway and come inside, "Come in. You belong." The words landed the way they always had, like the truest thing in the world, like something that had always been waiting to be said. Gerald Oma's crew from Precision Home Services arrived on the morning of Friday, January 19th, 2024, the day after Breonna Caldwell's story ran on NJ Spotlight News, before the world had fully found it, while it was still a Newark story rather than a global one. There were 4 of them, Gerald himself and 3 members of his regular crew, men who had worked together long enough to move around each other without talking, handing tools back and forth with the wordless efficiency of people who have built a shared language out of years of shared work. They wore heavy coats and work boots, and they arrived at 7:45 in the morning with 2 pickup trucks and a trailer carrying materials. Gerald had done the inspection on Thursday as scheduled. He had stood on the roof of 214 Kinney Street in the January cold and looked at what needed doing with the careful, unhurried eye of a man who had been assessing damaged roofs in Newark for 19 years. The left side needed a full replacement. New decking, new underlayment, new shingles. The flashing around the chimney had separated and was allowing water to track down the interior wall. The insulation beneath the damaged section had absorbed enough moisture over the past 18 months that it needed to come out entirely and be replaced. The estimate was $16,400. He had called Vanessa Ortega with the number, feeling a slight uncertainty about delivering a figure that size. Vanessa had said, "Can you start Friday?" Gerald had said yes. Vanessa had said, "Then we'll have a deposit to you by tomorrow morning." And that had been the entirety of the negotiation. Before his crew climbed to the roof that Friday morning, Gerald knocked on Miss Boykin's door and introduced himself properly. He shook her hand with both of his and told her his crew would work cleanly and carefully, and that they would be finished within 2 days. He told her the noise would be significant, roofing always was, but that they would work around her schedule if she needed quiet for any portion of the day. Miss Boykins looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Oma," she said, "I taught school for 43 years. I am not troubled by noise." Gerald smiled. "Yes, ma'am," he told his crew, before they started, to treat the job the way they would treat their own mother's house. They did. While the roof was being replaced above her, the rest of the house began to reveal its other needs, the way houses do when someone finally starts paying attention to them. It was Vanessa Ortega, arriving in Newark on the Monday after the roofing started, who began making the list. The bathroom had a slow leak beneath the sink that had been silently damaging the subfloor for at least a year. A plumber came on Tuesday, fixed within 2 hours. The furnace was 14 years old and operating at roughly 60% of its designed efficiency, laboring the way an old engine labors when it's been asked to do more than it has left to give. A heating and cooling company out of Elizabeth, New Jersey, sent a technician on Wednesday. The assessment was clear. The furnace needed replacement, not repair. A new high-efficiency unit was installed by Thursday afternoon. That Thursday evening, for the first time in at least 2 winters, the house on Kinney Street was genuinely, evenly, thoroughly warm. Miss Boykins stood in the hallway for a moment after the technicians left and felt it. The particular quality of real warmth that comes from something working properly rather than something working desperately. She put her hand flat against the wall, the way you put your hand against something to confirm it's real. It was real. She went back to her armchair and picked up her book, and did not say anything about it to anyone. But Claudette Moreau, who arrived with Tuesday soup and stayed through Thursday because the situation seemed to call for it, saw her face when she came in from the hallway and understood everything that face was saying, without a single word being exchanged. Shaq came back on Saturday, January 27th. No cameras, no press, no announcement on any platform. Just him and Marcus and Vanessa, and a rented truck that had been loaded in a storage facility in East Orange the previous afternoon. He wore the same gray hoodie. He had learned from the first visit not to be dressed for anything other than being there. Marcus Webb had spent the previous Saturday rebuilding the front porch steps. New lumber, properly sistered joists, a surface that didn't bend or shift under any weight. He had come back on his own time, with his own tools, and he had done it the way a craftsman does a thing when he cares about it. He had also noticed, while he was there, that the back porch railing was loose where it met the post. He had fixed that too, without being asked, and without mentioning it until it was done. From the truck, Shaq and Vanessa unloaded what he had brought. A new armchair, not a grand or showy piece of furniture, but a precisely chosen one. Adjustable, high-armed, with the arm height calibrated to make standing from a seated position manageable for someone using a cane. The kind of chair that a good occupational therapist would recommend for someone with arthritis in their hands and knees. He had spent 40 minutes on the phone with a medical supply specialist in Orlando before ordering it, asking questions until he understood exactly what the right specifications were. A bedroom space heater with a proper thermostat and an automatic shutoff, not to replace the new furnace, but because old houses have cold spots that even good furnaces don't fully reach. And he had noticed on his first visit that the hallway toward the bedroom was noticeably cooler than the living room. And a television. The old one had a crack running diagonally across the lower left corner of the screen, patched, again, with clear tape. The picture still worked. The sound still worked, but the crack spread a thin shadow across that corner of the image that would have driven most people to replacement years ago. Miss Boykins had not replaced it because replacement cost money she had allocated elsewhere. When Shaq carried the new television through the door, Miss Boykins put down her book and looked at it, and then looked at him with an expression that said, clearly and without ambiguity, that they were about to have a conversation about this. "I don't need a new television," she said. "Yours has a crack in it," he said. "The picture works perfectly well." Miss Boykins. "Shaquille, I am not a woman who replaces things that are still functioning." He set the television down carefully, straightened up, looked at her. "What if I told you he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words like a chess player choosing a move, that I appear on television every single week, and that I would feel personally and professionally troubled every time you watched me through a cracked screen. Miss Boykins looked at him for a long, assessing moment. That, she said slowly, is the most manipulative argument I have heard in 79 years of living. But is it working? She pressed her lips together. He could see the edges of her self-control working against something that wanted to be a smile. The something won. Put it in the corner, she said, pointing. Not where the old one was. The angle from the chair is better from the corner. He grinned. The full grin, the one that had been on cereal boxes and billboards and magazine covers, deployed now in a 79-year-old woman's living room in Newark, New Jersey, in the service of winning an argument about a television. Yes, ma'am, he said. By 3 o'clock that Saturday afternoon, word had moved through the immediate neighborhood the way word moves in close communities. Not through phones or social media, but through the older and more reliable network of people who notice things from windows and front stoops and mention them to the next person they see. There were 8 children on the sidewalk outside 214 Kinney Street, ages ranging from 6 to 14. Puffy coats, winter boots, the particular combination of boldness and uncertainty that children have when they want to approach something but aren't entirely sure of their welcome. They stood at a respectful distance from the SUV and looked at the porch. Shaq came out and looked at them. Then he walked down the new steps and waved them over. What followed was not planned, not staged, not photographed. It was simply a very large man sitting on a cold porch on a January afternoon in Newark, talking to 8 children about school. He asked their names. He asked what grade they were in. He asked what subjects they liked, and what they found hard, and what they wanted to be. A girl named Amara, 9 years old, with 2 pom-pom barrettes and a coat 2 sizes too large, said she wanted to be a surgeon. Then be one, Shaq said simply. Don't let anybody talk you out of it, not even yourself. A boy named Deshaun, 12 years old, tall for his age in the particular way that tall 12-year-olds are tall, all limbs and uncertainty, shoulders slightly forward, head slightly down, said he didn't know yet what he wanted to be. Shaq looked at him for a moment. Something in the boy's posture, the hunch, the practiced smallness of someone who had learned that being large attracted attention he wasn't sure he wanted, traveled straight through 40 years and landed somewhere immediate and real. That's okay, Shaq said. When I was exactly your age, I didn't know either. Deshaun looked up from under his hood. For real? For real, Shaq said. I was 12 years old, new in a city where I didn't know anybody. Too big for every chair I sat in. Somebody told me I was going to be all right anyway. And I was. Deshaun considered this with the serious, unhurried consideration that 12-year-olds apply to things that matter to them. Who told you? He asked. Shaq turned slightly and looked back at the front window of the pale yellow house. Miss Boykins was in her new armchair, right where he had positioned it, angled to see both the wall of children and the street. She was watching. Her hands were folded over her cane. Her tea was on the table beside her. The teacher who lives in that house, Shaq said. Deshaun followed his gaze to the window. Miss Boykins, seeing them look, raised one hand in a small, unhurried wave. Deshaun raised his hand back. And something passed between a 79-year-old woman in a warm house and a 12-year-old boy on a cold sidewalk that didn't need a name to be exactly what it was. The GoFundMe for Miss Boykins closed on the morning of Saturday, February 3, 2024. Final total, $143,000. Tariq Delacour, the Newark math teacher who had created the page 13 days earlier in a quiet moment of conviction at his kitchen table, stared at the number on his screen for a long time before he could say anything about it to anyone. He had hoped, when he set the page up, for maybe $10,000. He had thought that would be meaningful. He had thought that would say something worth saying about what the world owed the people who had quietly, faithfully given it their best years. $143,000 said something considerably louder. He called Vanessa Ortega, whose number he had found through the NJ Spotlight news story, and told her the page had closed. Vanessa thanked him warmly and told him what Shaq's team had already been quietly building while the donations came in. A structured plan for the money that would make it last, that would protect Miss Boykins without diminishing her, that would give her stability without making her feel like a charity case displayed for public sympathy. The plan centered on a small trust, administered through an established Newark nonprofit called the Greater Newark Education Foundation, an organization that had been working in the city's school communities since 1998, providing resources to students, teachers, and educational programs in underfunded districts. They had the infrastructure, the legal framework, and the mission alignment to manage the trust properly and transparently. Vanessa drove up from Orlando specifically to explain the details to Miss Boykins in person. She had decided, correctly, that this conversation deserved a human being in the room rather than a phone call or an email, that the dignity of the arrangement required the dignity of presence. She sat across from Miss Boykins in the living room on a Tuesday afternoon in early February, while Claudette Moreau made tea in the kitchen, and she went through every element of the structure carefully and completely. How the funds would be held, how they would be dispersed, what expenses they would cover, housing maintenance, medical bills, utilities, and a modest monthly supplement to her existing income. How long the funds would last at a reasonable disbursement rate, who would manage the account, and how it would be overseen. Miss Boykins listened to all of it with the focused attention of a woman who had once taught arithmetic to fifth graders and had not forgotten how numbers worked. When Vanessa finished, Miss Boykins said, "I want a copy of every financial statement, monthly." "Absolutely," Vanessa said. "I want to understand every line item. You'll have full transparency. And I want to know the name and contact information of the person at the foundation responsible for this account. Not a department, a person." Vanessa nodded. "I'll have that to you by end of week." Miss Boykins looked at her for a moment over her glasses. Then she said, "You are very good at your job." Vanessa, who had been told many things in 4 years of working for one of the most demanding and high-profile figures in American entertainment, felt this particular compliment land somewhere specific and warm. "I learned from someone who doesn't accept anything less," she said. Miss Boykins considered this. Then she nodded once, satisfied, and picked up her tea. But the story, by then, had grown beyond one house on one street in one city. Something had been set loose in the world by Brianna Caldwell's careful, specific, human piece of journalism. Something that had been waiting, perhaps, for exactly this shape of story to come along and give it a direction to move in. The New Jersey Education Association, the state's largest teachers' union, representing more than 200,000 active and retired educators, had been watching the story develop since the first weekend it went national. Their communications director, a sharp and tireless woman named Patricia Ogundimu, had been in contact with NJ Spotlight News within days of the story running, asking for permission to reference it in a formal advocacy letter. On February 7, 2024, the NJA sent a letter to the office of Governor Phil Murphy, calling for a formal review of pension levels for retired teachers in New Jersey, specifically those who had spent their careers in underfunded urban school districts like Newark, Camden, and Trenton, where salaries had historically lagged behind state averages, producing pension calculations that reflected decades of systemic underpayment. The letter was 12 pages long, carefully researched, and full of data. But it was the opening paragraph that the press picked up and ran with. It began, "Estelle Marguerite Boykins taught the children of Newark for 43 years. She did this faithfully, skillfully, and without complaint. She retired in 2003 with a monthly pension of $1,140. This is what New Jersey decided her life's work was worth. We are writing to ask whether this is truly the answer we are comfortable with. It was not a comfortable question. On Valentine's Day, February 14, 2024, a date that felt, to everyone paying attention, either perfectly symbolic or entirely coincidental, depending on how you looked at things, Governor Murphy held a press conference in Trenton. He announced the formation of a state task force to conduct a comprehensive review of pension structures for retired public school educators in New Jersey, with particular focus on teachers who had served in low-income urban districts. The task force would be required to present findings and recommendations within 9 months. He mentioned Estelle Boykins by name. He said, "What happened to her should not have happened, and our job now is to make sure it doesn't keep happening to the thousands of educators across this state who gave everything they had to our children and deserve better than what we have given them in return." In the pale yellow house on Kinney Street, Miss Boykins watched the press conference on her new television from her new armchair with Claudette beside her on the sofa and a cup of tea going cold on the table because she had forgotten to drink it. When the governor said her name, Claudette put her hand over Miss Boykins' hand. Miss Boykins did not cry. She sat very straight and very still, the way she always sat, her cane across her knees, her expression composed and unreadable in the way of someone who is feeling a great deal and has decided to feel it privately. When the press conference ended, she picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "Well," she said finally, into the quiet of the warm room. Claudette waited. "It took them long enough," Miss Boykins said. Claudette laughed. A real laugh, surprised and full, the kind that starts in the belly. Miss Boykins looked at her with the expression of someone who has made a joke and is pleased it landed, but will not be making a production of it. On the first Monday of February, Shaq appeared on Inside the NBA on TNT. His co-hosts, Charles Barkley, Kenny Smith, and Ernie Johnson, had been waiting for him to bring it up himself. They had all read the story. The whole country had read the story. But they knew Shaq well enough to know that this was not something you pushed him toward. This was something you left space for. He brought it up himself, near the end of the show, without being prompted. "I want to say something," he said. And the way he said it, without the usual comedic wind-up, without the performance energy that usually preceded his most memorable television moments, made the other 3 men go quiet immediately. Charles Barkley, who had spent 30 years on television being constitutionally incapable of stillness, went still. "Teachers don't make what they should make," Shaq said. He looked directly at the camera. Not at Charles, not at Kenny, not at Ernie. At the camera. At whoever was watching. They never have. And then they retire, and the world moves on, and we forget about them. We forget about the people who gave us our beginning. He paused. The studio was silent in a way that television studios are almost never silent. "Miss Boykins gave me my beginning," he said, "and I almost let that go without saying thank you. Don't let that happen with yours." The clip was viewed 23 million times in 72 hours. It became, quietly and without anyone planning it that way, a movement. And the woman who had started it, who had started all of it, really, 40 years ago with 4 words spoken to a scared boy in a doorway, sat in her warm house on Kinney Street and read her book in the evening light, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the world was paying attention to the right things. Not to her exactly. To what she represented. To what all of them represented. Every Miss Boykins in every Chancellor Avenue in every city in the country, giving their best years to other people's children and trusting that it mattered. It mattered. The world was finally saying so. But there was still one thing left. One thing that nobody knew about yet. One thing sitting in a shoebox under her bed that changed everything about the story. That reframed it, deepened it, turned it from something remarkable into something that would stay with people for the rest of their lives. It was coming. It had been waiting for 39 years. It was Claudette who finally asked. Because Claudette had been watching Miss Boykins carefully for 3 weeks, through the roofing crew and the new furnace and the television argument and the GoFundMe and the governor's press conference and all the former students knocking on the door. And she had noticed something that none of the others had noticed, because none of the others had known Estelle Marguerite Boykins for 11 years the way Claudette had. There was something unfinished in her, not unhappiness, not ingratitude, something else. The particular quality of a person carrying a thing they have not yet put down. A weight so familiar they had stopped feeling it as weight, and started feeling it simply as part of themselves, the way you stop noticing a scar until someone asks about it. It was a Tuesday evening in the second week of February. The soup was a chicken and dumpling. Claudette had switched from the black bean and sweet potato for the winter cold, a decision Miss Boykins had approved without saying so, which was her way of approving most things. The new furnace was running quietly and efficiently. The house was warm in a way it hadn't been warm in years. Outside, Kinney Street was dark and still, under a thin February sky. They had eaten. The bowls were in the kitchen. They were sitting in the living room, Claudette on the sofa, Miss Boykins in her armchair, with the comfortable, unhurried silence of two people who had long since passed the point of needing to fill quiet with noise. Then Claudette said it. "You have something else." Miss Boykins looked up from her book. Her reading glasses were on. She looked at Claudette over the tops of them. "I beg your pardon. You have something else," Claudette said again. Not accusing, not pressing, simply stating what she had seen, the way she always stated things, directly, without the elaborate social cushioning that most people applied to difficult observations. "Something you haven't said yet, something you haven't given him." Miss Boykins was quiet for a moment. "You are entirely too perceptive," she said, "for a person whose stated purpose here is soup." "That is precisely why I bring the soup," Claudette said calmly, "so that you will sit still long enough for me to notice things." The room held the words. Outside, a car moved slowly down Kinney Street, a dog somewhere in the distance, the furnace running its quiet, faithful hum. Miss Boykins closed her book. She set it on the table beside her tea. She folded her hands over her cane and looked at the wall of children for a long moment. All those faces, all those years, all that accumulated evidence of a life given over to something larger than itself. "Yes," she said finally, "I have something else." "For him?" "For him." Claudette waited. Miss Boykins did not speak immediately. She was organizing something. Not her words exactly, but the decision behind the words. The decision to open something that had been closed for a very long time. "When Shaquille was in my class," she began slowly, "he was only with us for a few months. The family moved, as army families always moved. But in those months, he was in my homeroom, and in my reading class, I had my students keep journals." She paused. "Every Friday afternoon, the last 40 minutes of the day. I called it the free write. They could write about anything they chose. Television programs, their families, their worries, their hopes, things they'd seen that week that struck them. Anything at all, as long as it was honest and as long as it was theirs." Claudette listened without moving. "Most students wrote a paragraph," Miss Boykins continued. "Some wrote half a page. A few wrote almost nothing and drew pictures in the margins instead, which I accepted because I understood that some children think in images rather than words." She paused again. Something shifted in her expression. Not sadness exactly, but the particular tenderness that comes from touching a very old memory and finding it still intact. "Shaquille wrote pages," she said, "every single Friday. While the other children were still staring at their blank pages or writing their first sentence, he was already filling his second page. He wrote with an enormous concentration. You could see it in his face. This boy who spent most of the school day trying to take up less space than he occupied, suddenly taking up all the space he needed on the page. He wasn't a polished writer at 12. His sentences were sometimes tangled. His spelling had ambitions that occasionally exceeded his execution. The ghost of a smile crossed her face. But he was honest, she said. Completely, almost recklessly honest in those journals. He wrote about being the new kid in a new city, about his stepfather's expectations, and the weight of them, about not knowing where he fit in the world, about the way people looked at him in hallways and the way that looking felt, like being an object rather than a person, about the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people and still feeling entirely alone. Claudette was very still. One Friday in November, Miss Boykins said, "He wrote something that I have read many times in the years since. Many times. I know it the way you know something you have returned to repeatedly because it won't let you go." She closed her eyes briefly. Not to remember, she already remembered. "To gather herself," he wrote. "Sometimes I think God made me too big by accident. Like he was building somebody else, and I got in the way and came out wrong. Like I am a mistake that learned to walk around. Miss B says, I belong here. I don't know if I believe her yet, but I believe that she believes it. And maybe right now that is the only thing I have, so I am going to hold on to it and see what happens." The room was completely silent. Claudette felt something move through her chest that had no clean name in French or English or the Haitian Creole she thought in when she was feeling things most deeply. "I kept the journals," Miss Boykins said. "I always kept them when a student left unexpectedly, held them in case the student came back, or I found a way to return them. With most students, eventually I did. With Shaquille, the family left so suddenly, and then the years simply went. And the journal is still here," Claudette said. "It was not a question. Under my bed," Miss Boykins said, "in a shoebox, with a few other things from that year." A silence. "What other things?" Claudette asked quietly. Miss Boykins looked at her for a moment. Then she set her cane to the side and rose from her chair with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had made a decision and was now executing it. She went down the hallway. Claudette heard the bedroom door, the slow crossing of the floor, the particular sound of something being retrieved from a low place. She came back carrying a shoebox, cardboard, old, a rubber band around it, the rubber gone brittle with age. She sat back down and set it on her lap and removed the rubber band with the careful hands of someone handling something that has earned its fragility. Inside the box, a stack of composition notebooks, each labeled with a strip of masking tape. A class photograph from 1984, 30 children in neat rows, a younger Miss Boykins at the far left, her hair still mostly dark, her yellow cardigan already a signature. And beneath all of that, two things that had been placed there separately and deliberately: a folded piece of paper, and a small white envelope, yellowed with time, sealed. She held up the composition notebook first. Black and white cover, the kind that cost 39 cents in 1984. On the masking tape label, in the large, careful handwriting of a 12-year-old trying to appear older than he felt, Shaquille O'Neal. She held it gently, both hands, the way you hold something that has been waiting a long time to be held by the right person. Then she unfolded the piece of paper. It was a drawing, pencil, rough and earnest in the way that 12-year-olds draw, all intention and limited technique, the desire to capture something outrunning the ability to capture it precisely. It showed a basketball player. Enormous, so tall that the figure went off the top edge of the paper, as if the paper itself hadn't been big enough to contain what the boy had imagined. The player was mid-dunk, arm extended, the ball already past the rim. Underneath, in that same careful handwriting, "This is what I'm going to be." Shaq Claudette looked at the drawing for a long time. "He drew this in class?" she asked. "During free draw period. October, I believe. About 6 weeks before the family moved. And you kept it?" "I kept it," Miss Boykins said, "because I believed him." She said it simply, without drama, the way you say a thing that was never in doubt. She had kept the drawing of an unknown 12-year-old boy who had declared with a pencil and a piece of paper what he intended to become, and she had believed him enough to save the evidence of his intention for 39 years, through every change and loss and difficulty of her own long life. Claudette looked at the envelope. Small, white, the paper gone the color of old cream, sealed with the original adhesive, never opened. On the front, in Miss Boykin's handwriting from 1985, younger handwriting, the letters slightly different, but unmistakably hers. Shaquille. Just his name. You wrote him a letter, Claudette said. After he left, Miss Boykin said. I didn't have an address. The family moved so frequently, I had no way to reach them. But I wrote it anyway. I thought, if I ever found a way to get it to him, or if he ever came back. She paused, looked at the envelope. 40 years passed instead. You never opened it? Claudette asked. In 40 years? It is not mine to open, Miss Boykin said. The certainty in her voice was absolute and quiet and entirely characteristic. I wrote it for him. It belongs to him. It has always belonged to him. Claudette looked at the sealed envelope in the old woman's careful hands. Then it is time, she said gently, to give it back. Shaq came back to Kinney Street on the afternoon of February 22nd, 2024. He came alone this time. No Marcus, no Vanessa. Just him, in the same gray hoodie, parking his own car. A decision that had required a brief argument with his security team, that he won by the simple method of getting in the car before anyone could stop him. Miss Boykins made tea. They sat. She placed the shoebox on the coffee table between them, without preamble or ceremony, because she was not a woman who believed that important things required elaborate framing. She told him about the journals. She told him about the free rights. She told him that he had written more than any student she had ever taught in 43 years of Friday afternoons. Then she picked up the composition notebook and held it out. He took it. He held it in his enormous hands and looked at his own name on the label. The name he had written at 12 years old, trying to look older. And he didn't open it immediately. He just held it, feeling the weight of it. The particular, impossible weight of something ordinary that has survived everything and remained exactly itself. When he finally opened it and began to read, his face moved through several things in quick, private succession. Things that belonged entirely to him and to the boy who had written the words, and to the space between who that boy had been and who this man had become. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright with something he didn't try to hide and didn't try to display. He breathed slowly through his nose, the way people breathe when they are keeping themselves together by paying careful attention to the basic mechanics of being alive. He read for a long time. He set the journal down carefully, picked up the drawing, looked at the figure going off the edge of the paper, looked at the words beneath it. This is what I'm going to be. He laughed. Not the big laugh, not the one that filled rooms and stadiums and television studios, but something smaller and more interior. The laugh of a person confronted with the specific absurdity of a dream that came entirely true. I ran out of paper, he said. I couldn't even fit the whole player on the page. You were always too large for the available space, Miss Boykin said. In every sense. Then she picked up the envelope. His laugh faded. He looked at it. What is that? He asked, though something in his voice suggested he already felt, without knowing, that whatever was in that envelope was the center of gravity the entire day had been orbiting. A letter, she said. I wrote it for you. In 1985, after you left. I sealed it and kept it, and I have never opened it because it was never mine to open. She held it out across the coffee table. It is yours, Shaquille. It has always been yours. He looked at the envelope for a long moment, at his name in her 40-year-old handwriting, at the yellowed paper and the sealed flap, and the 39 years of waiting, compressed into something he could hold in one hand. He took it. He turned it over, turned it back, ran his thumb very gently along the sealed edge, The way you touch something you are not yet ready to open, because opening it means the waiting is over, and the waiting has become, in its own strange way, a kind of faith. Can I read it now? He asked. That is entirely up to you, she said. He opened it. He unfolded the letter inside. 1 page, both sides. Her handwriting from 1985, covering the paper in careful, even lines. He read it. His eyes moved down the first side, and he turned it over and read the second. And as he read, something happened to his face that had never happened to it in any arena, any interview, any championship moment, any camera flash or crowd roar or trophy presentation in his entire public life. He went somewhere entirely private. Right there in the room, in the middle of everything. He went somewhere that was only his. A place built from the words on that page, and what they meant, and the 40 years between the writing and the reading. He went there and no one could follow him, and he did not try to come back until he was ready. Miss Boykins looked out the window. She gave him the room. She gave him the privacy of it, the way she had always given her students the privacy of their genuine moments, not looking away out of discomfort, but looking away out of respect. Because some things, when they finally arrive after a very long journey, deserve to be received without an audience. When he looked up, his eyes were wet. He did not hide it, and he did not perform it. They were simply wet, the way eyes get when something true has finally, after a very long time, been said directly to the person it was always meant for. "How did you know?" he whispered. She turned back from the window and looked at him steadily. "Know what?" she said. "Everything," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you know all of it? In 1985, before any of it had happened. How did you see it?" She looked at him for a long, still moment. The wall of children behind her, the warm room around them, the February light going thin and golden through the window. And then Estelle Marguerite Boykins, who had spent 43 years seeing children before they could see themselves, who had kept a letter sealed for 39 years out of the pure conviction that its recipient would eventually return to claim it, said the truest thing she knew, quietly, simply, the way she had always said the truest things. Because that is what teachers do, Shaquille. We see you before you see yourself. That is the whole job. That has always been the whole job. The room held the words. Outside on Kinney Street, the February light was fading. The oak tree in the yard stood bare and patient against the pale sky. The pale yellow house, cream now, with green trim, already ordered for the spring painting, sat warm and solid, and full of everything that had been said and kept and waited, and finally, after 39 years, returned to the person it belonged to. Shaq folded the letter carefully. He put it in his wallet, right behind his credit cards, right behind his driver's license, right next to the things a person carries because they cannot afford to lose them. He has carried it there ever since. The letter was never made public, not one word of it. Shaq never posted it, never read it aloud on television, never quoted it in an interview, never allowed a photograph of it to be taken, never described its contents to a journalist, a business partner, a co-host, a friend, or anyone who asked, and many people asked, because the story had reached the kind of size where the world felt it had earned the right to know everything. It had not earned that right. He made that clear, quietly and without apology, every single time someone pushed. The only thing he ever said about it. In a brief, careful answer given to a reporter from the Associated Press in late March 2024, when the question became impossible to keep deflecting, was this: "She told me things in 1985 that she had no way of knowing yet, and everything she said came true. Every single thing." I don't know how a person sees that far into someone else's future. Maybe some teachers just see further than the rest of us. Maybe that's what makes them what they are. He said it once. He never said more. Spring came to Kinney Street the way spring always comes to Newark. Not gently, not all at once, but in pieces. A warm afternoon followed by 3 cold days. Crocuses pushing up through the yard on the south side of the house, where the sun hit longest. The oak tree beginning its slow return, the bare branches filling in gradually, with the particular tender green of early April. The painters came on the first Saturday of April 2024. A crew of 4, recommended by Gerald Oma, who had become something of a guardian presence in the ongoing life of 214 Kinney Street. They worked for 2 days. The old pale yellow, peeling, tired, holding on out of habit rather than conviction, came off. The new color went on, cream, warm and clean and confident. Green trim on the window frames and the new porch railings. The color of something growing. Miss Boykins stood on the new front steps on the second afternoon and looked at it. She had chosen the colors herself, from a paint catalog, taking her time, considering and reconsidering with the seriousness she applied to every decision that mattered. Claudette had sat beside her while she chose and offered opinions that Miss Boykins had listened to carefully and then largely disregarded, which was entirely expected by both of them and held no offense on either side. She looked at the cream walls and the green trim in the April afternoon light. Yes, she said simply, to no one in particular, to the house, to the decision, to the spring. She went back inside. The Greater Newark Education Foundation released its first quarterly report on the Boykins Trust in April 2024. Every line item was listed. Every disbursement was accounted for. Miss Boykins read it at her kitchen table, with her reading glasses on and a cup of tea beside her and a red pen in her hand. Old teacher's habit. The red pen. Though she had promised Vanessa she would call with questions rather than corrections. She found no errors. She was mildly disappointed. But only mildly. On the first Tuesday of May 2024, a bill was introduced in the New Jersey State Legislature calling for a cost of living adjustment to pension payments for retired public school teachers who had served more than 30 years in districts classified as low income. It was sponsored by a state assemblywoman from Newark's North Ward named Gloria Reyes Chambers, who had herself been a public school teacher for 11 years before entering politics, and who had been waiting for exactly this kind of political moment to push for exactly this kind of change. The bill was nicknamed, informally and immediately and without anyone officially sanctioning the name, the Boykins Bill. Miss Boykins, when informed of this by Carolyn Westbrook Diaz over the phone, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell them to pass it. Not for me. For everyone who came before me, and everyone who comes after." Carolyn said she would. On the first Sunday of every month, Deshawn, the 12-year-old from Kinney Street, the tall boy with the hunched shoulders and the careful eyes, knocked on the door of the pale cream house with the green trim. Miss Boykins always answered. They sat in the living room, he on the sofa that had held up for 30 years, she in her armchair by the window, and she helped him with his schoolwork. Reading mostly. Sometimes math. Sometimes they just talked, the way she had always talked with the children who needed it most, honestly and directly, and without the soft, apologetic cushioning that adults so often wrapped around hard truths. She told him he was smart. He told her he wasn't sure about that. She told him that was exactly what someone smart, who was afraid of getting it wrong, would say. He thought about that for a while. She let him think. The letter stayed in Shaq's wallet. Through the rest of the 2023-24 NBA season broadcasting for TNT. Through the summer. Through the fall. Through every city and arena and studio and speaking engagement and business meeting and award ceremony, and all the enormous, relentless forward motion of a life as large and loud as his. Through all of it, in the back of his wallet, folded along the same crease it had been folded along in 1985, by the hands of a 42-year-old woman who had believed in a boy she had known for only a few months, and had written down what she believed, and sealed it, and kept it for 39 years, and trusted, without any particular evidence, that he would come back. He had come back. She had been right about that too. There is one more thing. The thing that nobody knows. The thing that changes the shape of everything that came before it when you finally learn it. The cliffhanger that has been sitting quietly at the center of this story since the very first page, waiting to be seen. On the evening of February 22nd, 2024, the same evening Shaq had sat in the living room on Kinney Street and read the journal and the letter and put the letter in his wallet, he had driven home in the dark through Newark streets that were quiet and cold and familiar in a way they had not felt familiar since he was 12 years old. He had called his mother from the car. "Mom," he said, "the letter. She wrote me a letter in 1985. "What did it say?" Lucille asked. A long silence. "She told me I was going to be something specific," Shaq said slowly. "Not just good, not just successful, something specific, something I have actually become." Lucille was quiet. "But that's not the part that got me," he said. "Then what part got you, baby?" Another silence. Longer this time. The Newark streets, sliding past the window in the dark. "At the end of the letter," he said, she wrote, "Wherever you end up, Shaquille, I want you to remember this. The children you pass on your way to the top are watching you the same way you are watching me right now. See them. Say the words. It costs nothing, and it builds everything. The whole world is made of children who needed someone to say, 'Come in, you belong.' Be that person for them. That is the real championship. That is the only one that lasts." Lucille O'Neill was silent for a very long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and quiet and full of the particular feeling of a mother who has watched her child travel an enormous distance and arrive, finally, exactly where he was supposed to be. "She knew," Lucille said. "She knew," Shaq said. On Kinney Street, in the warm, pale cream house with the green trim that hadn't been painted yet. That was still coming, still April, still ahead. Estelle Marguerite Boykins was reading. Her chair was by the window. Her tea was beside her. The wall of children looked down at her from every angle. All those faces, all those years, all that accumulated evidence of a life that had mattered enormously, and quietly, and without the world noticing until now. She turned a page. Outside, a boy named Deshaun was walking home from school in the February dark, passing beneath the streetlight at the corner of Kinney Street, his shoulders just slightly less hunched than they had been in January. Not all the way up yet, but rising, the way things rise when someone has finally told them they are allowed to. The way Shaquille O'Neal had risen 40 years ago, from a chair by a window in a classroom in Newark, carrying 4 words out into the world like a flame carried carefully between 2 cupped hands. "Come in, you belong," passed from one person to the next, the only championship that lasts. And that is the story of Shaquille O'Neal and the teacher who saw him before the world did. A woman who spent 43 years in a classroom, giving everything she had, and never asked for anything in return. A man who went back when he didn't have to, because the right thing to do is never really optional when your heart is paying attention. And a letter that waited 39 years to be read by the only person it was ever written for. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us, then you already understand why we tell stories like this one. Because the world has enough noise. What it needs more of is this: kindness, loyalty, the quiet, powerful act of going back for the people who believed in you before you believed in yourself. So before you go, drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in New York, London, Lagos, Sydney, Mumbai, somewhere in between? We read every single one, and we want to know where in the world this story found you today. And if this video made you feel something real, if it reminded you of a teacher, a mentor, someone who said the right thing at exactly the right moment and changed the direction of your life, hit that like button right now. Not for us. Do it for Miss Boykins. Do it for every teacher sitting in a classroom somewhere right now giving their absolute best to children who will one day carry those words further than anyone can imagine. And if you believe that stories like this one matter, that kindness deserves an audience just as much as anything else on the internet, then subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. We find the stories that remind you what people are capable of when they choose to show up for each other. And we are just getting started. Now go click on the video appearing on your screen right now. Because something tells us, you are exactly the kind of person who needs to hear that one next. We will see you there.